Good evening and welcome. You're watching NDTV. I'm Rishika Barua. Joining us as always this Saturday evening is the AIIMS Director, Dr. Randeep Guleria. Thank you so much, sir, for sparing the time of day to answer our questions on the coronavirus. I want to begin on a good note today. The AIIMS vaccine trial has begun. So that's a first, and might I take the liberty to say congratulations to all of us as well. But you know, just to understand for our viewers, how long will it take for India to find a vaccine, given that the first dose of Covaxin was administered to a 30-year-old just today?
So I think the vaccine trials normally take a number of years because we go in a sequence manner. We do phase 1 trials. Depending on the results of phase 1, you do phase 2, and then phase 3 trials where you do in a large number of individuals to look at the efficacy. Because of the pandemic, all of this is being compressed, and rather than doing it in sequence, we're doing it in parallel. So you're doing simultaneously phase 1, phase 2 trials. You're looking at doing early phase 3 trials. And at the same time, the manufacturers are taking the risk of already looking at manufacturing these vaccines, assuming that they will work, and therefore investing in that production so that as soon as the data is there that these vaccines are effective, you will have them in the market immediately, rather than that itself taking a few months.
Right.
So I think we are looking at a very compressed program, which in my mind by the end of this year, by early next year, should be complete. And if everything is all right and everything goes as per plan, we should be able to have the vaccine very soon.
All right. I think that's a very encouraging, very encouraging timeline in a certain sense. But Dr. Guleria, the other crucial question is accessibility to the vaccine. Given the fact that by the end of this year or beginning of next year, we can prove that we have a safe vaccine, how long till this vaccine is given to each and every Indian?
So that's what I mentioned. The manufacturers will start manufacturing it, and we must remember that 60% of all the global vaccines which are made are actually made in India. So we have a huge manufacturing capacity. At the same time, I do believe that it's not going to be possible on the first day or in the first few weeks to really be able to vaccinate everyone. We will have to prioritize. And the main aim of vaccination is to give it to the high risk group. Now, we know that younger people have very mild disease, and most of them don't really get all right without much treatment. So if we have to give the vaccine, it would be possibly to the high risk group, the elderly, those with comorbidities, the healthcare workers who are at a high chance of getting exposed and therefore getting serious infection. And then it would be prioritized to the other groups. But I'm quite confident that the bulk of vaccine manufacturing will occur in India,
right,
and therefore it would be available to a large number of the Indian population.
But then still a year at least, still the vaccine is available largely to to people who are, say, not in the high risk group, to the masses, so to speak.
So that will depend on how rapidly we can produce a vaccine, and because remember we have a huge population, so in absolute numbers it's huge. And it will take some time. I do agree, maybe a few months to be able to have vaccine for everyone in the population.
Right. The other big worry, of course, is India's rising cases. I mean, we're seeing some very worrying numbers this week, almost touching 50,000 cases in a day. How much higher does the caseload go before we flatten the curve?
So the cases in India will increase, and that is related to two parts. One is the fact that we are really testing a lot. We've now crossed doing more than 4 lakh tests a day. The more you test, the more you'll pick up, which is a good sign, because then you're able to take measures in terms of tracking, tracing, isolation, and treating these patients, so in these individuals. So that is a good sign. At the same time, there is also movement of the pandemic to smaller cities, and therefore that is also accounting for the increasing number of cases. What we've seen is that we initially had a large number of cases occurring in the metros.
Right.
If you look at data from many metros, it seems to have flattened there. The cases are coming down. But in smaller cities, where the population is less, the cases are showing a little bit of a spike. I'm hopeful that in the next few weeks we shall have a flattening there and they will also start coming down. But the pandemic will sort of evolve in different regions in a different manner.
Right. There's a question that one of our viewers has actually asked online, which is, are states like Bihar, Andhra Pradesh and Karnataka at the moment witnessing their peak? We've seen a sudden surge in cases in these select few states.
Yes, so they're showing a rising trend, and we'll need to see over the next few weeks how the cases behave. And then I think they will have a peak and they will start flattening. These are the cases where these are the states where the cases have actually now started rising, and there is a lot of focus in aggressively managing these states so that we are able to prevent a large spike and start bringing the cases down.
You know, you talk about aggressive management, which brings me to my next question. Are weekend lockdowns effective? Are 2-day lockdowns effective? You know, is that the best that we've got in terms of, because all that really seems to do is to just delay the spread of the infection. You can't really contain it.
So you will have to have a strategy where you aggressively are able to do a lot of sort of mapping of that area, see where clusters are developing, develop containment zones, and aggressively do a lockdown in those containment zones rather than the entire city, and do that for a number of days so that you can do house-to-house surveys. You can see who has influenza-like symptoms. They can be isolated, they can be tested. Everyone in that area can be tested and then asked to isolate themselves at home or in isolation facility. Doing 2 days lockdown will not help as far as the spread of the infection is concerned. It may give people time to prepare if they want to do that in terms of developing, say, the testing facilities and things like that. But as far as the control of the spread of the virus is concerned, that is too short a period to really break the chain of transmission.
Right. Another viewer asking us a question, Dr. Guleria, online on conducting examinations by September. This is something that the UGC has now said. That, you know, whether it's online, offline or a combination of both, but there will be exams, final year exams that will be held. Is it safe?
So that depends. We at the All India Institute of Medical Sciences have already conducted our All India exam, and we did it in more than 200 centers, but making sure that social distancing was maintained. We also we increased the number of centers almost by 100 to 150 so that people didn't have to travel far to give the exam, and made facilities available. We also had facilities that if someone was in quarantine, he could sit in a separate room and did not really have to mix.
Right.
And the examination pattern was in a sort of a paperless mechanism so that there was no contact as far as the students or the examiner was concerned.
Right.
So you have to be innovative in how to do this, but I think it is possible. And I think the important message here is that as we go through the pandemic, we should also make sure that the career of young individuals does not suffer, and they are also able to sort of go to their routine activities once the pandemic is over, rather than losing out on one whole year or one whole semester.
You know, it's very interesting that you say that, because you're essentially saying that no, it's not safe, but then we need to, make some unprecedented changes to the way we conduct the examinations in order to be able to do that. Do I understand you correctly?
Correct. So, like, for example, let me give you another example of how you need to be innovative. We have now moved to very aggressive teleconsultations. To maybe 6-7 months ago, we never thought that we would start having so many patients who you could see through teleconsultation. Everyone was through a physical consultation.
Right.
And you remember the huge lines that there would be outside AIIMS, people waiting, standing for hours. Now we've been able to show that you can, if you do teleconsultation, you can still manage a large number of individuals. Few you have to call for physical consultation. Also, it saves time. It saves money. People who have to really travel long distances and have to wait for hours for their turn now have an appointment. They don't have to travel. Through video conferencing or through the talks, they can actually consult the doctor.
Well, I think it is a new normal in every sense, and one definitely does have to therefore adopt. But, you know, since we've talked, Doctor, about the rising numbers, I think the other big question that is on everyone's mind is how long does immunity to the COVID-19 last? There's a recent study by the UK, university in the UK, that's actually shown that COVID antibodies fade quickly.
So I think you have to look at it. I don't think we understand the immunology or the immunity of the virus and the host in a complete manner. And we talk of antibodies, but there's also a T-cell immunity, which also plays a role as far as the immunity is concerned. And that sometimes may be more important. And there are some studies which suggest that while we keep looking at what is the antibodies in an individual, there may be a cell-mediated immunity or a T-cell immunity which may also be protecting them. And we've seen that in many cities like London, where the antibody titer in the population is still not that high, the pandemic has really come down dramatically. So there has to be some other mechanism which is protecting the individuals who are getting infected more than just the antibodies. And I feel we need to do more research to look at the immunity that an individual develops to this virus, which may be more than just the antibodies.
What about herd immunity? Is it a myth? There's another study again that's been published in Spain that casts serious doubts on the ideas of a herd immunity.
So the same thing, if you look at the study from Spain, which is a very large study done in the population, or you look at the serosurveillance done in Delhi, the numbers suggest that in Delhi it was 23%, in Spain it was even less than that in the population that they studied in the whole country. That if you look at the percentage of individuals who have the antibodies, it's very little to actually reach herd immunity. You will need at least 60% of the population to have herd immunity so that they don't get the infection and they don't transmit to others. Right. And therefore the chain of transmission is broken and the cases come down. But in many of these countries, including Spain, Italy, and even in London and New York, the data suggests that the immunity is not that high in terms of antibodies. But the pandemic has actually come down there and the number of cases actually have declined. So there has to be some other mechanisms which are also contributing to the decline in the number of cases. Of course, it's also social distancing and mask and hand washing. But the dramatic decline in the number of cases suggests that there is something else which is happening in terms of the immunity.
All right, that's very interesting. I think, a lot still needs to be known about this disease. But, another phenomenon, a very worrying phenomena that's come to light is the pediatric multisystem inflammatory syndrome that's being found in COVID positive kids. What more can you tell us about this?
So the multisystem inflammatory syndrome in children, which was initially thought to be Kawasaki syndrome, but it's not classically Kawasaki, has been reported from the UK, from various series in the US also. And it's a little bit of an interesting syndrome because it occurs after the child has recovered. It occurs in the younger age group, less than 18 years of age. And after they have recovered from COVID infection, right, then they develop an inflammatory syndrome in the body, which affects various organs, leading to even cardiac involvement, gastric involvement, skin involvement. And this seems to be more immune mediated, and therefore steroids, IV, intravenous immunoglobulin seem to help. And it's something that we need to look very closely in our population also, in children who recover, whether they develop this syndrome and whether there's some ethnic variation in the frequency of this syndrome in Asians as compared to the European population. But this is again a new syndrome which is, we're just learning more and more about it. Guidelines for its definition and diagnosis are still being made. It's an evolving scientific process.
All right. Still more to be known about this as well. The other big question is, of course, antigen tests versus the RT-PCR tests. Are antigen tests actually ineffective? One has cast several doubts over this. What do you have to say?
So we were involved in the initial studies as far as the rapid antigen test is concerned. And it depends on what we call the pre-test probability or the population that you're studying. So if you have an individual who has influenza-like syndrome, who has features of COVID, he's come with fever, cough, cold, and you do the rapid antigen test, there's a 70 to 80% chance that it will pick it up because your viral load is good. Now the rapid antigen test you put a nasal swab in the person's nose. It has to be done properly. What we found was that if you put the nasal swab in both nostrils one by one, the viral load is higher. And then you just put it into a small vial where the virus is killed, but the genetic material of the virus stays there. And then you just put it onto a card where you put 2 drops, and like a pregnancy test, a line will come to show whether it is positive or not.
Right.
Now this doesn't multiply the virus. The RT-PCR will also do it will do a nucleic acid amplification. It will amplify the virus so that if the viral load is less, the RT-PCR will pick it up.
Right.
If the the viral load is less, that the person is recovering or he's come late, then the antigen test may be negative. But if the antigen test is positive and you come to know within 15 minutes, you definitely can say this person has COVID 19 infection. It will not give you it is not, it cannot be false. The positivity is definitely there. Now, the important thing is that if you were to do it in a large number of, let's say, asymptomatic individuals, where the viral load is less, the test will perform not as well as in symptomatic individuals.
Right.
So I feel that if you use the test judiciously in an area where you have people who are symptomatic, it will help you to identify people early and isolate them immediately rather than waiting. Because sometimes what happens is in certain places, it was taking 4 to 5 days to get the RT-PCR report. And that person would have spread the infection for these 4 to 5 days and led to a larger number of people in the community getting the infection.
But then if you're saying that the accuracy of the antigen tests in asymptomatic individuals is still a question mark, are we underreporting the number of cases? Because the rapid antigen test is what is being used for mass testing.
Yes. So what the test says is that the ICMR says is that if you do it in asymptomatic individuals, you have to monitor them closely for the next few days if they are negative. And if they develop symptoms, you must test them again or do the RT-PCR test. So a negative test doesn't rule out infection and they still need to be monitored. A positive test identifies the individual immediately and he gets into the modality of isolation, treatment, and everything else that follows. So I think it's important that we understand how to place the test. If we just say that it will replace RT-PCR, that will not be right. The two tests complement each other.
All right, I think that is really crucial to understand. There's another very technical viewer question on whether the rise of white blood cells is an indicator of the COVID-19 infection. And if it is, then why not count white blood cells first by a total blood count test and then do an RT-PCR?
So there are a number of biomarkers which are being looked at to see whether we can use other modalities for diagnosing COVID-19 besides the RT-PCR.
Right.
One of them is looking at the white blood cells and the ratio of neutrophils to the lymphocytes. What happens is that the white blood cells do go up, but the lymphocytes come down significantly. And people are looking at lymphopenia, which sometimes gives you an idea that this person may have COVID-19. It's also been looked as a prognostic marker. If your low lymphocyte count persists for a longer time, it may suggest a more severe infection. Similarly, I have used a chest X-ray. Can you predict COVID-19 infection by a chest X-ray?
Yes.
We have a study done at AIIMS which have used artificial intelligence using a neural modeling, where with the chest X-ray they say that if your RT-PCR is negative, but the patient is symptomatic, by doing a chest X-ray, you could be diagnosed in some individuals that this X-ray is very suggestive of COVID-19, even if your RT-PCR is negative.
All right, very interesting. The other big question that's being asked is skin rashes. Is that a new symptom of the coronavirus, and what should one be watchful about?
So skin rashes from urtic area to itching to even vesicular rashes have been reported. They're not that common, but now a large number of what we call extrapulmonary manifestations of COVID are being reported. These include neurological, cardiac, skin, gastrointestinal, that is nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, skin rashes, especially the type sort of erythematous rash, which can be like a viral exanthema. And then, of course, cardiac events in the form of a heart attack or myocarditis, and strokes, and even encephalopathy has been reported now. So we're realizing that this is a significant systemic disease rather than just a simple viral pneumonia. And that is why the diagnostic criteria and the index of suspicion has changed significantly. We are now seeing patients who come, a young person who may come with a stroke and can turn out to be COVID-19 positive. I've seen a patient who presented only with diarrhea and had just fever and diarrhea, no respiratory symptoms, and had florid COVID infection in the lungs. So there are now, our knowledge and awareness as far as how COVID can behave is actually increasing, and that's making it more and more challenging for clinicians now to start managing COVID-19, especially in areas where now we're also seeing non-COVID patients and there is an overlap in the symptoms.
All right. So several symptoms actually manifesting themselves at this point. There's been an advisory against the use of N95 masks. Doctor, what would you like to tell people?
So the advisory is actually against using N95 rebreathe mask, which has a filter in it or a rebreathable valve in it. Now, if you look at N95 masks, if you're using it, there are two ways that you can use an N95. One is in a COVID ward, where you have COVID positive patients, where you are not worried about yourself giving the infection to the patient because these patients are already positive. There an N95 with the breathable mask can be worn because this mask makes it easy to wear.
Right.
But when you breathe in, the mask acts as a filter. But when you breathe out, the valve opens and you breathe out whatever without any filtering mechanism.
Right.
Now, if the same mask is used in the general population, then if you have a person who's asymptomatic and he is infectious, when he breathes out and there is no filtering, then his infection will travel into the environment and the mask will have no protection to the other people who have come in contact with him. So when you're working in a common area, when you're going out, or you're in an area where it is a non-COVID area, everyone should wear a mask, an N95 mask, which doesn't have a valve, because if you are an asymptomatic individual
Right.
who has infection, you don't want your infection to go to the others also, and that's why the valve in that circumstances you should not have a valve.
Well, I think that explains a lot, and that's very useful advice. Very last question. There's a new blood test to detect COVID-19 in heart patients. How does this really help, and how is it different from an ordinary blood test?
So there are a lot of cardiac markers which are looked at, which looks at various markers in the heart, because when we talk, like we just mentioned, that COVID-19 can cause a lot of systemic effects, and sometimes it leads to increase in cardiac enzymes. And these increase in cardiac enzymes are picked up in the blood, and therefore this can also be used as a marker in someone who has myocarditis or cardiac involvement. We still need more data to show how sensitive and specific blood biomarkers are in definitely making a diagnosis. Like we discussed the total leukocytic count and the lymphocytes coming low, or the chest X-ray.
Right.
We really need to really understand how sensitive and specific are these when we use it in a large population in being able to definitely diagnose COVID-19 infection as compared to other non-COVID illnesses.
But then do you recommend that heart patients actually go ahead and get this test done, especially
No,
those who have severe conditions?
No. So what is usually done is that if you are suspecting COVID infection and you are looking at whether there is cardiac involvement, then you can get these tests done. But as a routine, it's not recommended that
Right.
everyone should get these tests done. It will really not serve any diagnostic purpose.
All right, a whole host of questions on the coronavirus answered with so much clarity. Thank you so much, Dr. Guleria, for sparing the time of day and answering our questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you.